Nuke Talk is a podcast brought to you by Plowshares, the largest foundation in the U.S. solely focused on reducing the threat of nuclear weapons.
The creation and production of the atomic bomb left its mark not only on U.S. foreign policy, but on the cities where production was centered, and the lives and relationships of the people who lived in those cities. We're talking about nuclear weapons' influence on race, socioeconomic status, and the environment, and how all of that has carried on to modern day. And today we're taking a trip to Amarillo, Texas, where the Pantex site lies just 17 miles northeast in Carson County. It's an active federal facility operated by the Consolidated Nuclear Security, LLC, which manages and operates the facility along with the Y-12 National Security Complex in Tennessee under a single contract from the U.S. Department of Energy and the National Security Administration. The Pantex Plant is the only remaining assembly and disassembly plant for nuclear weapons in the United States. And if you think the name Pantex sounds familiar, it might be because there was a recent wildland fire in the Texas Panhandle that forced the Pantex plant to temporarily cease operations and evacuate non-essential workers in February. And the story was widely covered by the media. If a wildland fire were to directly impact the site, the health and safety implications would be severe. So what is the history of Pantex, and what is the story of the nuclear legacy in Texas? Pantex was built to support the U.S. government during wartime. The Pantex Ordnance Plant was created as a result of the need for munitions during World War II. The site is located east of Amarillo, Texas, on 16,000 acres of land. Operations began on September 17, 1942, only 9 months after construction began. Pantex was the last of 14 ordnance plants to be built in Texas to support the war effort. And just in 3 years, Pantex produced nearly 4 million conventional bombs and artillery shells. And on August 16, 1945, just one day after Japan formally surrendered, the Pantex Ordnance Plant ceased operations, and Texas Technological College, now Texas Tech University, leased the land for just $1. However, there was a recapture clause, meaning that the federal government could reclaim the land in case of national security incident, which they did only 6 years later in 1951. Following World War II, we saw a new kind of war, the Cold War, which refers to a period of geopolitical tension between the United States and the former Soviet Union, during which the U.S. nuclear arsenal rapidly developed to, quote, compete with the Soviet Union's rapidly increasing nuclear arsenal. So the federal government reclaimed the land and facilities that made up the Pantex plant and undertook a building campaign to create what they would call the cornerstone of the nuclear weapons complex. To understand how this all came to be, we need to go back to the beginning. And to help us look at the beginning is Lucie Genay, a French nuclear scholar and associate professor of U.S. Civilization in the English and American Studies Department at the University of Limoges in France. She is the author of the book Under the Cap of Invisibility, the Pantex Nuclear Weapons Plant and the Texas Panhandle.
So when I finished my first big research project, which was on the nuclear weapons industry in New Mexico, I was really piqued by this facility just a few hours east of Albuquerque, whose name I had seen mentioned a couple of times in the archives, but very rarely. So that was Pantex. It came up, but I started looking into it because I found it strange that the site almost never came up in the literature that I had read up to then. I knew about Los Alamos and Trinity and Hanford and Oak Ridge, Rocky Flats, Livermore, all those sites that were quite well known, but Pantex seemed like much less famous and almost obscure place. So I was intrigued and I started planning a research trip to the Texas Panhandle, where Pantex is located, to find out more about the place where ultimately, almost all the nuclear weapons in the U.S. arsenal have been assembled or disassembled. And so during this preliminary phase of the project, I found out that one single book had been written about Pantex's history. It was written by a novelist called Grace Moshtabai, who moved to Amarillo, which is the town right next to Pantex, in the 1980s. And her work really was my starting point, as well as an article that was written by Alex Hunt, who teaches at Texas A&M University. And he helped me a lot when I got there. And that's when I found the collection, the archival collection put together by a photographer called Sharon Stewart, who actually lives in New Mexico. I met her a couple of summers ago. And her collection is called The Toxic Tour of Texas, and it provided the bulk of the material that I used in the book.
Her book is one of the few that sheds light on the story of Pantex and the Panhandle at large, and the story is a complicated one. Pantex began operations in 1942, only 9 months after the commencement of construction, and it was built on 16,000 acres of land that was not exactly empty at the time.
So originally Pantex was Pan-Tex. It was Panhandle of Texas. It was the name given to a small high school for local kids. There were about 20 students in the 1920s. And then during World War II, the War Department took over the property of the school through eminent domain, and also the properties of a few farms surrounding the area to build an ammunition plant. Some Pantex neighbors actually mentioned this bitter memory of their parents or their grandparents' expropriation. And some even suspected that because St. Francis, which is the parish next to Pantex, was a German community, mainly German, they suspected that it had been targeted because of that, because no one would dare question or complain the decision. In fact, the criteria for the Army were similar to other planes: unbroken land, solid buildings, access to water and rail transportation, proximity to a regional hub, in this case, Amarillo, distance from borders and coastlines, of course, because that's part of strategic depth for the Army. So the Pantex plant produced conventional bombs and artillery shells during the war, and it hired a lot of workers locally, mainly many women, actually, because men were being drafted into service at the time. So at the end of the war, the ordnance plant was declared surplus and transferred to the Texas Tech College of Lubbock, which developed a research farm to address problems in agriculture. But just a few years later, the newly created Atomic Energy Commission reclaimed Pantex.
Similar to Hanford, Washington, which saw the further development of the Tri-Cities to accommodate the needs for housing for those who worked at the facility, there was a housing demand in the Amarillo area as early as 1943. The National Housing Administration, now the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, approved 175 new homes for Pantex employees with 3 or more family members, which seemed to not suffice at the time, which then led to an additional 360 1- to 3-bedroom apartments being built. The area would be known as Pantex City. There are apartments and homes with plans to develop a shopping center. And the homes were prefabricated, which refers to a mass production method, which meant that the materials were made in a factory, transported, and then assembled on-site. Turning the construction around within the year of 1943, approximately 400 more prefab homes were added to the Pantex village, bringing its population to a few thousand. At the height of World War II, Pantex Village had 69 residential buildings, a community center, and a store, supporting approximately 5,325 Pantex employees. And before the end of World War II, the village was fairly isolated, functioning as a self-sufficient community. It was 10 miles from the Panhandle and only accessible via a perimeter gate, which was locked each evening. The prefab materials and the thin walls of the village earned its nickname Cardboard Village to some outsiders. Upon acquisition of the plant and the village by Texas Technological College, now Texas Tech University, in 1949, after the ordnance plant ceased operations, Carson County was given control of where the plant and village were. But due to the recapture clause in the agreement between the government and Texas Technological College, which stated that the government could reclaim the land in case of a national security incident, the government reclaimed that land in 1951 as the Cold War intensified. With this, Pantex became a key component of the U.S. nuclear weapons complex.
And so the AEC was created in 1947 and was looking for sites where nuclear weapons could be assembled, and they naturally turned to the sites that had been used for conventional weapons during World War II. At first, they thought that 5 assembly plants might be necessary. This turned out to be an overestimation. They chose their first plants, which had been an ordnance plant during World War II, in Iowa. It was a place called Burlington. So that was the first one. And then in 1951, Pantex was reopened and added. And the way that the work was divided was that the bombs designed at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory in California were sent to be assembled at Pantex. And those that were designed at Los Alamos National Laboratories in New Mexico were sent to Burlington. And then in 1975, Burlington was closed, and all assembly operations were transferred to the Texas Panhandle.
And the closure of the Burlington facility was when Pantex became the sole assembly and disassembly facility in the U.S., essentially becoming the cornerstone of the U.S. nuclear weapons complex. Though to those who worked at the facility, it didn't seem like much of a change at the time.
What I noticed in the material, in the archival sources, when Pantex managers talked about the operations at the plant and in the 70s and 80s, they often said that the facility had a lot in common with any other industrial plant and factory, that there was a lot of imagination going on about what the plant was like, but they always described it in very mundane terms. It was an assembly line, and workers assembled nuclear weapons components that were being shipped in from manufacturing plants all across the country. So the transition from putting together conventional bombs to nuclear ones was actually not such a huge change for the plant, although it did require new buildings to accommodate the new mission. And of course, in 1956, the famous gravel gerties were built, under which the most sensitive work was being performed to prevent the spread of radionuclides in in the unlikely case of a detonation. Then the gravel would fall into the workers. And Pantex also had a secondary mission, which actually led to the most contamination of the environment, which was the production of high explosives. And so the high explosive detonators are placed inside nuclear warheads, were produced and tested at Pantex as well, and those had to be attached to the plutonium core.
As nuclear weapons were assembled and disassembled, citizens and workers remained in the dark to a certain extent.
So, of course, secrecy and what is called compartmentalization were legacies of the wartime era, when people only knew as much as they needed to know to perform their assigned task. So there are testimonies or interviews from early days where people said who had secretarial jobs or things like that that were not directly related to nuclear weapons, said they had no idea. And people in surrounding communities did not know what Pantex did at first. And in fact, because the first contractor was Procter and Gamble, the rumor was that they manufactured soap products at Pantex. And when they would test high explosives and a big boom was heard by the nearby neighbors, there was a joke going around that, oh, a soap bubble must have burst. And so this tradition of secrecy inherited from the wartime years continued into the early days of the Cold War. When you look at the plant's magazine, which is called the Pantexan, which started publication during World War II, you see a lot of ads and messages to Pantexans that the U.S. troops are counting on them to produce ammunitions, but also to remain silent about the nature of their jobs. So it was only in the late 1960s that a local newspaper, the Amarillo Daily News, announced officially the nuclear mission of Pantex, and then it became more widespread. People knew what was going on there. And the first impact of Pantex was really economic, actually. People were hired there. They made good wages at the plant, and then they could spend the money in town. There was a lot of prestige, both patriotic and socioeconomic prestige in being hired at Pantex. And in some families, actually, bomb production became a transgenerational phenomenon where young employees today will tell stories about their grandmothers who worked at Pantex during World War II, and how their parents were also hired during the Cold War. So it really became a tradition for some families.
But as the impact of Pantex on workers' health began making itself known throughout the community, Feelings of nationalism joined a conflicted attitude for those who worked at Pantex and whose families have worked at the facility for generations.
So the very patriotic discourse and the pride in one's work in participating in national security is something that really transpires in most of the testimonies or voices that I recovered from newspapers, from various sources that were in the archives. And there was really also, we can tie that to a sense almost of martyrdom for some of the workers, when in the year 2000 was a year when there were public hearings about occupational illnesses across the nuclear weapons complex. And so for the first time, Pantexans, so Pantex workers, were able to talk about some of the health issues that they had and they associated with their work at Pantex, using all kinds of substances that could be toxic, not necessarily nuclear or radioactive, but sometimes solvents and other things. And many of them still expressed a lot of pride, and despite some of the drawbacks of their work, they were still very happy that they were able to contribute, and they saw it almost as something to expect from the job, that if you're going to be working at Pantex, yes, you might develop illnesses or problems. And so that's why there were, in 2015, there was a major strike at Pantex, because workers need good coverage and health insurance, because one of them actually talked about Pantex workers as ticking time bombs, because they knowing that at one point or another they might develop some kind of illness. Yeah.
I'm Roxanne Elder from Texas and a proud longtime donor to the Plowshares Fund. Thanks for tuning in today. Not many folks who live in Texas even know that the Pantex plant exists. Interesting and scary fact is that the Pantex plant has not had a site-wide environmental impact study since 1996. And while there are an estimated 2,500 warheads they are awaiting to be dismantled, instead, the Pantex plant is increasing its budget to build new weapons to further destabilize work towards a more peaceful world. Nuke Talk is just one of the many important projects of the Plowshares Fund. I hope you'll join me in supporting hundreds of organizations and people who drive policies and activities that help eliminate nuclear threats and support transformational thinking and activities that can make nuclear disarmament a reality in our lifetime. You may not know that 100% of your donation will go directly to our grant-making and programmatic activities, with nothing subtracted for administrative or fundraising costs. Find out more at plowshares.org. And now, back to the podcast to learn more about the Pantex plant, just northeast of Amarillo, where the end of the world begins.
In Texas and across the U.S., this pattern of hiding nuclear weapons impact is not just limited to nuclear weapons plants, but the stories of those impacted seems to have been omitted from history as well. The sentiment is shared by downwinders like Barbara and Kaysie Kent. Barbara was just 13 years old when the Trinity test was conducted in 1945. The El Paso native just happened to be in New Mexico on a trip, less than 50 miles from where the Trinity test took place.
Hi, I'm Kaysie Kent, and I am Barbara Kent's daughter.
Hi, July 16, 1945. I was 13 years old, and I went, Karma Dean, my dance instructor, always took around 10 girls up to Ruidoso for the summer camp. We were so excited to be up there around 5:30 in the morning. Everyone that was in the upper bunk bed, we all fell to the floor. And we were sitting there sort of dazed, wondering what is going on. So anyhow, we finally had Karma come running in, and she's the one that owns the camp. And just so you know, all the people there were all from El Paso. So anyway, Karma came running in and she said, "We think there's a hot water heater that has exploded, but we can't find it. So everyone run outside." So we all ran outside. And at the time, it was very, very dark. And we couldn't really see anything, but we were all sitting and saying, "What is going on?" When we looked up at the sky would keep changing on us. It was very, very strange. It went from not hearing a thing or seeing a thing to seeing all this stuff in the sky. And we realized, when it changed on us, when we looked up, it really hurt our eyes. Then Karma came out again and said, "I think the best thing to do is come on inside if it's hurting your eyes." So we all went inside and we had breakfast. We were there. And someone came running in and said, "It's snowing outside." So we said, "Oh, Karma, can we go outside in the snow? To snow in July, that is so great." So she said, "Okay, after breakfast, you can go out and put your bathing suits on." So everybody went outside. I had pictures of the girls, and what we're doing, we're grabbing the snow and putting it all over our face. And oh my gosh, we're having the best time you can't imagine. And then somebody said, "Well, it doesn't snow. It is hot. Snow is cold." And we thought, well, that's okay. It's July. We didn't know at that time, nobody knew the difference between any of this because nobody had ever heard of what's going on. So anyway, Karma thought we should come back inside because we kept complaining that it was warm, but it felt good. So we did go inside, and about an hour later, because we didn't have television in those days, Karma was saying, "We're supposed to go downtown Ruidoso tomorrow. They'll tell us what's going on." By now, it's much, much lighter, the sky, but it still hurt your eyes. And then finally, the next day, we all went downtown. We were supposed to hear what was going on. He was the general that spoke, and I don't remember his name. But anyway, he spoke and said, "Don't worry, everything's fine. You don't have to worry." So it was terrible that the government lied to us because so many thousands of people died that night. And the next day, we lost so many friends at such young ages. And so many, we lost a few in their 20s, and we lost quite a few going from the 30s to the 40s. And they were never able to even have children or anything. So that's really the story that I remember. And it's a very sad that the government has not done anything about this.
Barbara was just 13 years old in 1945. Today, she's 92 years old. And unfortunately, due to her exposure to the Trinity test, Barbara and her family have had to deal with many different illnesses, including cancer. Barbara has survived skin cancer, endometrium cancer, and thyroid cancer. 2 of her daughters have had breast cancer, and unfortunately her daughter Jody Johnson passed away from lung cancer last December. However, the majority of Texas lawmakers do not consider radiation exposure a Texas issue, even though many downwinders and workers from the facilities like Pantex are facing health complications. And for advocates like Barbara and Kaysie Kent, their work to get Texas lawmakers to consider radiation exposure as a Texas issue has been a long process.
It's gone back a long time. Fortunately, we just had a little bit of a breakthrough. Ted Cruz did sign on to the bill in the Senate. Cornyn did not. Veronica Escobar's office has really been pushing to get El Paso in the bill. We're not in the bill. They might have signed on to it, but they have not gone as far as to get Texas in the bill. Escobar's office is doing her best, and they're very hopeful that she can get Ledger Fernandez's office to include, if not all of Texas, at least the regions that are within the 150-mile range, which will really help. However, we all know when something goes down the river, everybody's exposed to it one way or the other. But at least that's a start, and that's a help. I don't know what's taken so long. And our response has been to our face, yes, everybody smiles, and then nothing has happened. So the fact that we are getting some push right now and some action is it's a little bit of a relief, and we're very happy about that. In the House, Johnson has not put it on the floor, but actually, since there are so many Republicans now that are for this, he's changing his tune. So we're hopeful that something will happen.
So the younger generations of advocate families are carrying on the torch not only to see the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, known as RECA, become extended and expanded before it expires in June 2024, but also to see Texas included in this bill.
Well, we have spent a lot of time on the phone, writing letters. We have been to Washington several times, talking to both sides of the aisle. It's been a lot of work, but it's something that in my mother's lifetime, she really wants to see this through before she passes away. And the feeling a lot of times is, these people that, they're going to die off and it won't be an issue to us. Obviously, some of the feedback is, well, what is it going to cost? Which that's an arguable point, because what it costs in healthcare is more than what it costs to help people with the healthcare. I mean, the government's paying for it one way or the other. It's been a long road, and it's not just me and my mom going. My other sisters have been involved, and we're all doing our part.
I have 3 daughters. Jody just passed away, and Allison's had breast cancer. Kaysie is fine.
I'm okay. We're going to will it okay. But yes, I'm the only one in the family that has not had a hysterectomy.
Barbara Kent has been an advocate for those impacted by nuclear weapons for almost the entirety of her life, in hopes to not only see an extended and expanded RECA, but to also bring awareness to the nuclear legacy in Texas. And the nuclear legacy in Texas has often been kept in the shadows, in part due to what some scholars call the cap of invisibility.
So just to explain, well, first, of course, invisibility is a key concept in the nuclear scholarship, notably because radioactivity itself is invisible to the senses. But as many scholars have demonstrated, invisibility extended to people, places, and impacts as well, not just the ionizing radiation. So the expression cap of invisibility comes from an interview that was given by Grace Moshabai about her own book, and she referred to an art critic who used this image to talk about objects of everyday life that become invisible to us when we see them constantly. They wear a cap of invisibility, which is the magical helmet worn by Athena, the goddess of warfare in Greek mythology. Whoever wears this helmet becomes invisible. And Mujtabai argued that the Pantex plant was like one of those invisibilized objects that people don't see anymore or become desensitized to because they're constantly exposed to them. And so she was so fascinated that she traveled to the Texas Panhandle in 1982 from New York to find out how people live in the shadow of final assembly. Her answer mostly focused on religion, which is a fascinating aspect. So she focused on the religiosity of the local population and on the economic benefits from the plants. And my work expanded on her conclusions to analyze all the facets of Pantex's invisibility that includes the local people. So that's part of what I've called Pantexism, which is a variation on nuclearism, which is the faith in nuclear weapons to guarantee national security. So we could define Pantexism as the reasons why Texas panhandlers embrace nuclear weapons production, why they partly became dependent on that industry, and how they built up, in some cases, unconditional support for the Pantex plant, even in the face of some of the alarming aspects of nuclear bomb making. So it's all the ways in which the plant was able to turn itself into a regional fixture and fit into the cultural fabric of the Panhandle. So by creating and maintaining good relations with the business and agricultural or farming and ranching communities, for example, starting early on, even during the war, to show that nuclear bombs and food productions make a good fit, make a profitable combination, despite the apparent incongruity of those two together. Or even by supporting all manners of local activities and associations. Pantex really made itself part of the landscape, and the local populations participated in creating this cap of invisibility. But there were moments, especially in the 1980s, 1990s, when some of the locals realized that they had also invisibilized themselves in the process. And when Pantex was considered for expansion, that's when it created a major neighbor fight, essentially, between the plant and its closest neighbors.
And while this almost neighborly relationship between Pantex and the community is a complicated one, Pantex throughout the decades has worked to foster and maintain a close relationship with the community.
It really was a partnership that relied on blending in by really making Pantex compatible with local sensibilities, including conservatism, whether it's social political conservatism or Texan values, things that were dear to the heart of the farmers, the ranchers, the people, the seed producers. There's a whole economy based on agriculture. Of course, there was also a military base in Amarillo that was, it was a major scandal when it was closed down by the Johnson administration in the 1960s. So there's also this sense of patriotism. If you look at the local publications and news outlets, there are often articles about veterans and troops. And so there's a form of militarism. And of course, the Western folklore was part of the whole iconography of the Pantex plant in the early years in the Pantexan. So those are all elements that I tried to dissect in the book. And also a major difference that I think helps to explain why all of a sudden in the late 20th century there was this movement of Pantex neighbors against expansion, was that the plant did not really handle plutonium or uranium at all. It actually came to the plant already packaged. So the plutonium pits would be coming from Rocky Flats and would just be assembled into the nuclear weapons. So most of the contamination at Pantex is connected to those solvents that I mentioned earlier, the high explosives, also some tritium, because tritium is a gas that is highly volatile and needs to be replaced into the warheads. But so when Complex 21, which was this reconfiguration program for the whole complex, was developed in the 90s, so there was this project of transferring some of the Rocky Flats activities to Pantex and recycling plutonium, the surplus of plutonium that had come out of this plant, which was criticized for its contamination of the local Denver area and its fires. In Idaho, they also got a lot of waste from Rocky Flats that they struggled with because it was not labeled properly. And still today, you have contamination of the local aquifer due to the Rocky Flats radioactive waste. So that's also why there was this massive mobilization of that was really led by farmers that lived right next door and said, well, first, we don't want our land to be taken away. Expansion will require a larger buffer zone. And the other reason why some of the local ranchers and farmers mobilized against this project called Complex 21 was that they had obviously noticed that everywhere plutonium was involved, there had been major environmental damage. And one rancher that I talked to called Bill O'Brien started an operation called Common Sense, because to him, it made common sense to not accept any plutonium at this facility that was relatively unharmed, although it was already a Superfund by this point. It was on the list, on the EPA list of Superfunds. So there were contaminants in the water. And of course, the lifeblood of the region is the Ogallala aquifer that provides drinking water and irrigation water, not just for the Panhandle of Texas, but for 8 states in all, and is seriously endangered. Well, also endangered by excess farming, actually.
And the expansion of the plant has reinforced this complicated relationship between Pantex and the community throughout the years.
If you look at the activist literature, so all the newsletters, etc., there is definitely bitterness or criticism, but or even some mocking on, but that went both ways, because in Amarillo you also had local, like what you might call city boosters, who were looking forward to having Pantex expansion and new missions, because it would create emulation, of more business, more economic growth, and influx of people. So it was really almost an urban versus rural world kind of divide. So with the people that I talked to, most of my sources were historical sources, written sources, but I did get to do a couple of interviews with people who were involved, especially the Smiths, who were always repeated that they never wanted Pantex to shut down. They never were looking for the end of the Pantex era. They just wanted to maintain the status quo. They want, as long as Pantex did not endanger their operations or the marketability of their products and their land, they could continue to live in harmony almost. But the plutonium issue, that really, they told me at first they had never heard of plutonium. They didn't know what it was. So they had to train themselves to teach themselves all those complex scientific concepts and how it affects the body, how it affects the environment, the concept of half-lives. And they became their own experts, really digging into the jargon of the scientific literature. But their main objective was accountability, making sure that there would be no plutonium processing. So although Pantex inherited the storage, they call it the babysitting plutonium pits, essentially, or pit sitting, if you want. So that was considered not really as a failure or as a defeat, because at least they had managed to make sure that the Rocky Flats operations and the recycling, the MOX fuel, which was the heart of the project, would not end up at Pantex. So in that regard, they told me, years later, 20 years later, that they were happy with the result of their mobilization because there was more transparency. Pantex was more communicative with the local population and had heard their concerns. And it had, apart from the pit sitting, it had not expanded enormously. They had not brought in uranium or plutonium, no more than they used to handle.
Given that Pantex builds and disassembles nuclear weapons, it's pretty important that the site remains secure and safe from any threats. But in early February of this year, a wildland fire in the Texas Panhandle, now called the Smokehouse Creek Fire, burned so close to the facility, just 4 to 5 miles north, that it was forced to evacuate its non-essential staff. Pantex also began construction on a fire barrier to protect its facilities. At a press conference the evening of the fire, a nuclear safety engineer with the National Nuclear Security Administration's production office at Pantex said that the evacuations were out of an abundance of caution. And in a later Facebook post, the plant declared that all weapons and special materials were safe and unaffected. The Smokehouse Creek Fire is now the largest wildfire in Texas history. An estimated 1 million acres have burned. The previous record holder, now the second largest wildland fire in Texas history, was the East Amarillo Complex Fire in the winter of 2006, which burned over 900,000 acres. The most recent fire sparked widespread media coverage for fear that due to the fact that if wildland fire were to impact the site directly, the health and safety implications could be enormous. It is estimated that up to 20,000 plutonium cores, or pits, from the disassembled nuclear weapons can be stored on site, though the exact figure remains classified. And according to Lucie, this is not the first time that Pantex has garnered massive media attention.
Well, the first thing maybe that we'll say about that, when you said that the projectors, the spotlights were on Pantex again, almost for the first time, probably in a young person's lifetime, it is reminiscent of 1981 when Bishop Matheson, well, he was priest at the time, Leroy Matheson was a priest at the parish of St. Francis, and he publicly took a stand against Pantex and encouraged Pantex workers to resign on moral grounds because of the government's plans to develop the neutron bomb, which was considered as a highly immoral weapon, especially by the Catholic Church. So that's really when the spotlight hit Pantex, maybe for the first time, I would argue, and that attracted a lot of attention at the time. So maybe we can make a parallel here with the fire. But to me, so I would say that, yeah, I find the intersection of the nuclear industry and climate change particularly interesting and concerning as well, obviously. There have been, as you probably know, there have been other cases of wildfires near Pantex over the years. I found a lot of instances of that in the archival material. But those are bound to happen more often due to climate change. And so it does pose questions about Pantex, about the preparedness and adaptability of the Pantex plant to those risks. And at the same time, and this is something that I addressed in the book, especially in the conclusion, there's a form of dark irony, I find, in the fact that the Pantex plant might actually be better equipped or might be more likely to survive some of the effects of climate change in the region, the desertification of the area. It might be the only activity that will be left possible in that area if the water comes to be completely depleted. And so yes, there is this dark irony related to the type of agriculture that is practiced, the intensive industrial agriculture and livestock raising that surround Pantex, and the plant's water needs are actually relatively low in comparison to ranches and farms, or even municipal needs for Amarillo. So I do think that climate disruption is definitely a crucial lens through which nuclear legacies need to be addressed.
This episode is dedicated in memory of Jody Johnson. It's important that we say the names and the stories of those that have passed due to illnesses related to nuclear weapons exposure. And thank you to our guests for this episode, Barbara and Kaysie Kent, and Lucie Genay, Associate Professor of U.S. Civilization in the English and American Studies Department at the University of Limoges, France, and the author of the book, Under the Cap of Invisibility, the Pantex Nuclear Weapons Plant and the Texas Panhandle. And thank you for listening to Nuke Talk, brought to you by Plowshares. To support our work on the podcast and in making our world safer from the nuclear threat, visit plowshares.org. See you next episode.